Welcome back to In-Depth Literature. In today's video, I'm going to teach you and talk about why you should be reading toxic male authors. Now, just for the record, I do not believe that any of the authors that we are going to discuss today are in fact toxic. I do not believe in toxic masculinity. I think that masculinity and femininity is a spectrum, and whether you're male, female, or whatever, you can definitely have toxic traits. But we were living in a literary world now, a sort of a socio-political landscape now, where the old canon of male authors is being demonized as a form of antiquated toxic masculinity, whatever that is. Now, you probably have some perception of the modern day concept of toxic masculinity, whether or not you believe in it. Yes, there are some traits in masculinity that can or could be perceived as toxic. In terms of the literary spectrum that we're sort of living in nowadays, sort of the idea of stoic, resilient, defensive masculinity is nowadays not considered politically correct, and is considered, in fact, toxic. I can share with you why toxic masculine authors are important to read, whether it's Shakespeare or Tolstoy or Jack Kerouac, Thomas Wolfe, Ernest Hemingway. Toxic masculinity has been with us in literature since medieval times, early medieval times with Chaucer, and even later on with William Shakespeare. You know, we've always had male authors that write from a male viewpoint, and why that is demonized or considered toxic is, to me, just completely outrageous. If a female were to write a book, we would not consider it in the least bit toxic. I mean, I just finished reading a couple of weeks ago, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and there was tons of toxic femininity and toxic femininity within that novel, within Maya Angelou's worldview. And for some reason, we are not bringing to the table the toxic or alleged potentially toxic aspects of femininity, but we are demonizing the male authors in the college spectrum, in the media, on TikTok. Now, I think the majority of most literature enthusiasts are able to sort of separate the art from the artist, right? I mean, that's kind of what a literary fan is, a reader is not judging a author, whether they're male or female, by the standards of the modern times that you live in. And that's the problem that we live in now, socially and politically and intellectually, is that we are expecting Ernest Hemingway and William Shakespeare and all these old authors, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, in fact, to have the same modern perceptions of gender or social class or socio-political worldviews and inspirations. We are almost holding a toxic candle to the past, expecting the past to illuminate us with modern values. And whether or not you believe in sort of these masculine, feminine, feminist, anti-feminist tropes, you can still appreciate the old writers, the old literature. I mean, unfortunately, you know, for better or worse, women authors, yes, have not been given as much credit as perhaps they are due. Every couple of years, we're discovering old Renaissance women authors, 18th century, 19th century, 17th century women authors. So yes, there are a lot of really good women authors that have perhaps been overlooked or lost to time or lost to the patriarchy, which I don't really particularly believe in. In terms of this idea of toxic male authors, I mean, really, male authors have set up the entire foundation for literature, for ancient literature, modern literature. Like I said, illuminating or trying to illuminate past, or expecting that the past will be illuminated with these modern concepts. But let's talk a little bit about why these classic authors are sort of demonized. Let's start with something like Shakespeare. I mean, the play Hamlet is nowadays considered by modern college professors as being toxic. You know, Hamlet or King Lear even perhaps they are these toxic masculine figures that are perhaps narcissistic, or they are sexist, whatever that particular perception they have of what they believe to be sexist. But what they're missing the point in these old authors is that these authors were living in a man's world where men had so much responsibility. Yes, they had power, they had prestige, they had wealth, but with all of that comes a tremendous amount of stoic responsibility, and these characters are flawed. Yes, Hamlet, King Lear, Romeo, all these classic characters that we get to know, Richard III, Julius Caesar. Yes, they have confidence, they have a libido, they have sort of a self-assured egotistical worldview sometimes. I don't necessarily think they don't all fall into the same category, but to say that Shakespeare's characters are somehow misogynistic or toxic is really, it's an ignorant perception, because they're not, these critics are not putting themselves in the shoes of these old characters and these old authors. Literature people are all about, their sort of MO is to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. Don't judge. Be accepting. By the grace of God go I, and all this sort of motivational, inspirational, hopeful sort of stuff that they preach, but they are not practicing what they preach. In fact, because they are demonizing these male authors that are such a wealth of knowledge and spiritual enlightenment potential, if they could just put their restrictions down, their expectations, their egos. You know, I've been in art classes with people that did not like my art because it was from a male's point of view or a male perspective. And don't even get me started on the male gaze, but this idea in literature that I was reading something on Reddit the other day, and somebody said that I don't understand why Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina is considered a classic, because it's limited to the male gaze and it's misogynistic, and it doesn't focus enough on the plight of the females. And whether or not you think Anna Karenina or even Shakespeare or Ernest Hemingway or any of these authors are great writers, or even if their books, whether or not you think their books are great, you have to understand that somebody like Tolstoy, I mean, yes, he was limited in his masculine worldview. He cannot, up until a point, he can only get into the female perspective as best he can to a certain point, but he has to, the rest is left to imagination, or perhaps what's left unsaid in the female characters. And this idea that men are not allowed to write or to make art about women or about anything that has to do with the feminine experience is completely ludicrous, because women are in fact celebrated for doing that very thing. I mean, look at J.K. Rowling and her depiction of Harry Potter. She wrote an entire novel series about from a male perspective. And it's just this whole idea of divisive stuff that doesn't, it's just an excuse to scoff at the classic authors. You know, if we're talking about somebody like Tolstoy or Ernest Hemingway or even Dostoevsky, yes, they were limited by their masculine experience, but that's what made them great, is the fact that they were men. You know, they are not women. They don't completely understand the plight of women, but they get pretty darn close, especially some of Dostoevsky's characters. And I think if we want to appreciate literature, we have to take it for what it is. I mean, we would not go to a Maya Angelou novel or a Toni Morrison novel and demonize her for not depicting male experience in a proper manner, or you know, there's tons of sort of antagonistic racial elements to Maya Angelou's worldview in her sort of her early repertoire. Eventually she kind of comes to terms with it and she explores it. But when I was reading Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, her early perceptions of white people and white culture was pretty limited. It was pretty antagonistic. But was I offended by it? No. Did I want to get the book banned? No, absolutely not. In fact, I was for going along on this ride through the perspective of a female author, from a female writer that was not telling me that everything I do as a white straight male is great, you know. And I think that's the problem, is that readers and critics and professors in particular, they are intimidated by anything that sort of conflicts with their worldview. And if you're going to shut the door on every single book that, you know, challenges your worldview or your life experience, you're not going to be able to read any books. You know, you're going to be stuck reading, I don't know, fairy tales or literature that's not very good. You know, let's talk about somebody like Charles Bukowski. Yes, he has a lot of antagonistic, potentially toxic masculine traits, but that's why people enjoy, in fact, Charles Bukowski, because he is unapologetically himself and he is unapologetically male. But you will get a spectrum with Charles Bukowski. A lot of people don't understand the entire atmosphere that exists within the Bukowski universe. He has beautiful, heartfelt poetry about falling in love or taking a shower with his girlfriend or his lover. Yes, he has a whole book dedicated to his sexual escapades, but within that toxic masculinity is a wealth of information and dialogue and monologues of experience of what it's like to be male. Charles Bukowski's writing does not say that because I am a male this is okay. No, in fact, he's challenging those toxic masculine traits, and that's what people do not understand. We could even go with an author like Thomas Wolfe, who was considered, nowadays he's not very well discussed, probably primarily not only because of the style of his writing is considered too verbose, grandiose, and over the top, but also he touched upon a lot of racial things that today would not necessarily be 100% acceptable. But how do we learn from these old authors? How do we learn from the past? And how do we learn about how far we've come as a society and as writers and as literature if we cannot go back and explore and enjoy and also confront and, yes, critique these old toxic male authors? I'm not saying that we should accept it at face value and that we shouldn't challenge or question anything that they're writing, but we have to be able to enjoy these old authors and sort of leave them where they are in the past. Yes, they're still relevant. I'm not demonizing any of these authors because I enjoy all these authors. Of course, I see their shortcomings, but I'm not coming at these authors expecting that they are going to give me an ego boost or that they are going to teach me about something racially or politically or sort of socio-politically or gender-wise that equates to some type of progress that we've achieved today. Because no, these writers were living, half a century or more in the past. They had a limited template of what they could achieve in terms of their literature. We just made a really interesting in-depth video about Ernest Hemingway, and we talked about sort of these sort of toxic masculine traits that exist very strongly and very prevalently in the world of Ernest Hemingway. But guess what, fellas, guys and gals and fellas, everybody out there, that's why we enjoy Ernest Hemingway, because he is unapologetically Ernest Hemingway. That's why we enjoy Thomas Wolfe and Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy and Henry Miller, because they are unapologetically themselves. We would not ask authors, we should not rather ask authors to be anything but what they are. Why would we do that? So why do we do this sort of reverse psychology with these old male authors? And more importantly, as we head towards the last part of this lecture, I think the male experience, although yes, it can be antagonistic and maybe prejudiced and full of attitude and full of libido and full of the male experience, but having said all of those things, the male experience in literature has given us some of the greatest books of all time, and the fact that we are limiting our potential to understand the world experience through these male authors is really sad. And before I interrupted myself a little bit earlier in the video, I wanted to sort of reiterate the fact that there's a lot of really great people on YouTube and on the internet, on TikTok, and writing blogs. Plenty of women, in fact, out there that can take on the challenge of these old toxic male authors. And I'm, kind of rolling my eyes at that because I do not believe in that concept, although I see where they're coming from. Yeah, Henry Miller's a toxic male author, right? Ernest Hemingway has got some toxic masculinity. Jack Kerouac, for sure. Charles Bukowski, of course. But that does not mean that we still cannot enjoy these authors. Half of the fans of Charles Bukowski and Jack Kerouac were, in fact, women. Same thing with Henry Miller. Yes, they have a high male readership, but on the other side of the spectrum, that alleged toxic masculine literature or those toxic masculine worldviews are in fact what's enchanting to the opposite gender, whether it's a female or a male being toxic. Sort of that limited perception is what makes attraction. That's kind of what makes men and women sort of come together, is the limited experience. Men and women are very imperfectly incomplete without each other, and sort of the merging of the two, of masculinity and femininity, that's what opens up the floodgates to really understanding the limitations of your own gender or your own life experience. This could also expound into other things like race or social-political experience or upbringing or trauma bonding or all sorts of things. We bring our very, unfortunately, very limited experience to artistic expression. I mean, we wouldn't go back in time and ask Vincent van Gogh or Leonardo da Vinci to paint differently. That would be completely, preposterous. But for some reason with literature, it's easier to sort of demonize and attack, particularly male authors. Even Toni Morrison and in fact Maya Angelou are considered controversial for a lot of different reasons. So maybe I'm reading a little too far into it. I'm not saying that I'm offended because toxic masculinity or toxic male authors are challenged. I think we should be looking at authors and literature through a new lens. But this idea that just because we live in whatever year we live in now, almost 2026, that we're all of a sudden holier than thou, and we're all so enlightened by so much farther than everybody else, is just completely egotistical, and it does not serve any purpose to furthering writing. I mean, that's why we have to, I hate to quote, write conscious, but must we have some type of literary renaissance where authors are encouraged to break the barriers and to in fact purposely offend people. I mean, look at somebody like David Foster Wallace. A lot of his material, not even that long ago, he wrote, and he passed away in 2011, I believe, but they're claiming that David Foster Wallace is a toxic male author. Does he have toxic masculine traits in his literature? Yes. But guess what? Again, that is why we enjoy David Foster Wallace, because it's such a neurotic, oftentimes limited perspective, but it's not really limited. I mean, if you look at a particular life experience, whether it's a man, whether it's an author, Ernest Hemingway, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Thomas Wolfe, David Foster Wallace, if you can't enjoy a limited experience, the best ability that the author was able to muster within their somewhat limited experience here on Earth, their very, very short time here on Earth. If you're going to ban or just disregard every single male author that's ever come because he writes about sex, or he writes about drinking and smoking and womanizing, or he writes about things that he's passionate about but maybe he doesn't completely understand, then guess what? You're just going to be stuck reading things that make you feel safe. And we don't read literature to feel safe and to feel comforted and to be babied. We read literature, in fact, to confront and sort of deal with these conflicting aspects of human nature. I mean, Robert Greene talks about that a lot. Is Robert Greene a toxic male author? Probably by most standards nowadays, yes. The 48 Laws of Power, The Art of Seduction, I mean, yes. But that's why, maybe my experience is limited as a male. That's why maybe I sort of enjoy sort of these male authors, because they sort of maybe give recognition, or they sort of bring to fruition, or they sort of rationalize, what's the word I'm looking for? They sort of reiterate, perhaps, I can't quite figure out the word I'm looking for, but they reinforce, I guess I would say, my male experience. And I get such a thrill out of reading about how men feel about things, how men interact in the world, how men interact with the opposite sex, how men interact in the workplace, how men interact with art. And really, the history of art, I don't want to say it was dominated by men, but the male, men made such a great impact on the artistic spectrum, whether it's painting or drawing or poetry or architecture or anything. I mean, the fact that, let me know in the comments below, let me know what you think about this conversation. Or do you think most people with half a brain can come to Ernest Hemingway or David Foster Wallace or William Faulkner or Charles Bukowski or Shakespeare and get something out of it, even though it is from a toxic male perspective, right? And I think that is sort of what I'm trying to explain, is that the male experience is such a rich, unique way to look at the world, whether or not you agree with it, just like the female experience in literature is just as important too. Tennessee Williams, I mean, is he a toxic male author, even though he was a homosexual man? He wrote an entire play, if you haven't read it, The Streetcar Named Desire, about a woman, from a woman's perspective, about a woman who suffers assault and abuse and trauma and mental illness. Is he a toxic male author? I don't know. What I'm trying to reiterate is, it seems like some authors get a free pass, maybe because they're not straight, or they're not completely, they're, either they're female, or they may be homosexual, or they lean somewhere socially or politically that is more aligned with sort of the more modern socio-political leftist sort of agenda that is sort of at play nowadays. But I think in terms of literature and art, yes, socio-political themes and gender and all of those things that make us sort of a modern society, those things come up in literature, and they should be at least discussed or examined or critiqued. But should they be demonized and banned and completely forgotten about and considered problematic? No, that's just complete, utter nonsense. Some of the greatest novels in the world are about toxic characters. I mean, look at Notes from the Underground. Look at Crime and Punishment with Raskolnikov. Look at some of the characters in Leo Tolstoy's novel. I mean, look at The Death of Ivan Ilyich, about a man, and he's on his deathbed, and he has all these resentments about his relationship with his wife and his kids, and he realizes that his life fell short of a really strong, meaningful spiritual purpose because he was so focused on success, and he was focused on sort of the traditional family structure that he thought would give him validation. But on his deathbed, he reaches this beautiful, blissful state of forgiveness, and he sort of forgives his family, and he loves his family. And if that's a toxic male writer or a toxic male character, then I don't know what is. I mean, yes, some of these male characters and these male authors start out with toxic masculine traits, but usually by the end of it, they reach some type of redemption and they learn from themselves. So let me know what you think about this entire conversation. I did want to open up the dialogue about this. We do have some really interesting in-depth book analysis is coming up for you. Make sure you guys check out all the playlists. Follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Please join us over on Substack at In-Depth Literature. We're also on TikTok. And make sure you guys like, share, and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And join the conversation. What do you think about toxic male authors? What do you think about toxic female authors? Do you think it's okay for women to write toxic feminine literature? Of course it is nowadays. On the same token, at the same point in time, the male authors are being stomped all over because they are somehow promoting toxic masculinity. It's definitely an interesting conversation. I'm not really taking sides. I'm just trying to ruffle some feathers and let you guys know what I think about these old male authors. I think they're important. Those are the best authors, really, to me, are the toxic male authors. That's where I get the most enrichment from, for inspiration from my own writing. Yes, I do read female authors, but as a man, it's harder to find female authors, and maybe women can relate to this as well, unless they're well versed on the classics. We are attracted to, or we gravitate towards what is similar to our life experience. That's why I like Thomas Wolfe so much, because he has this existential dread, and he has this connection to his family and his home, and he's obsessed with the passage of time, and it's almost like, I'm reincarnated with all the same feelings that Thomas Wolfe had, or Ernest Hemingway had, or Charles Bukowski had. So how, in fact, can these authors, how can they be toxic when their work is timeless? Let me know in the comment section below, and we will see you all in the next video.